Oskvig. Welcome to the Trails Collective interview series. How are you on this very stifly June 9th evening?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well too. I actually had the day off from my job today. I've been working on the weekends, so it was nice not to be running around too much out there and taking some nice needed downtime after the busy weekend we had. So I'm pretty good. So what do you do for work?
I am an ordained pastor, so I'm a clergy person in a Christian congregation, a United Methodist congregation. And I am an adjunct professor of religion here at Canisius College in Buffalo.
Okay, all right. I went to Damen for a year, so I know where Canisius is.
That's around the corner from my house.
Yeah, it's. Oh wait, so you live in that nice gated community?
I'm not gated. I live on the low end of the hill, but Long Meadow Road, which is I'm less than a mile from the Damen campus.
Nice. It was pretty. I love Buffalo, and I mean, I've run the Buffalo Marathon twice, and so it's a wonderful place. I always thought you were from Rochester, but then I was recently reminded you're actually not. You're from Buffalo, you live in Buffalo. You're from Rochester.
Yeah, I graduated high school in Rochester. So my family moved several times before we moved to Rochester. So I lived in Texas and Missouri and kind of all over the place. So it's always been hard to lock down where I'm from. But I've lived in Buffalo longer than I've lived anywhere else. So at this point, I suppose it's easiest just to say that I'm from Buffalo.
Did you do a lot of traveling for ministry?
No, I've pretty much been in this area since I finished graduate school. So I was in Massachusetts at Boston University for graduate school. And the first church that I served was in Niagara Falls. And then I served a church in Lancaster, and then one in Elma, and then Kenmore, and now one in Amherst. So I've always kind of been in this greater Buffalo area since I got out of seminary, which is not necessarily typical. Some pastors do kind of go much further in geography, but this region in which I'm in includes all of Upper New York. So it could well be that I could have gotten a call to serve in Ithaca or Lake Placid or Albany. It just so happens everywhere I've served so far has been in Buffalo.
That's interesting. So explain, so my brother's in seminary. I think he wants to do missionary work. He went to China, and when he came back, he's been to Indonesia. I think he wants to do something like that. But explain to me a little bit how it works. So do you like sub different churches, or do you have like a home church, or how does it work?
In the United Methodist system, the way that it typically works is probably more comparable to the military, where we serve is based on a one-year appointment. And typically we serve in that physical location for more than 1 year, but each year is looked at as a new year of assignment within that location. So for us, we kind of salute and go when we get that call of, we have something open we'd like you to consider. It's pretty much one of those, that's where you're going to go. So I served for 4 years in Niagara Falls and 2 years in Lancaster, 7 years in Elma, 2 years in Kenmore, and then I've been in Amherst. This is my third year, I think, now at this church in Amherst, and I'm hopeful that this will be a longer tenure for me. My daughter's 10. She's only been in school here in Amherst, so for the sake of stability of family, it would be nice to kind of just stay put.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's hard to, I guess, it takes a while to develop like your church family, and then being like thrown out of it, I guess, not thrown out, but like called away from that, especially if you've developed roots and a really good system. And if you, like, if the church is growing, that's really important. The church that I went to throughout my whole childhood and high school, like towards the end, I think I started middle school, and one of our pastor left that had been there the whole time. And then, oh my goodness, like going through so many different pastors and interim pastors and like the divisions in the church, and then people had stopped going, and it was a sight to see, I have to say.
Yeah, it is. It can be a very tough thing, because we as clergy are also, when we leave a place, are asked to try to, as much as possible, though our interpersonal relationships are fine to maintain, to try to give room to whomever the new clergy person is and not function or over-function as the clergy from the past. So it's tough when you, as you said, when you develop those relationships and then have to begin anew in a new place and also leave behind those old ones.
You also, in addition to being a pastor and a father, you also run a little bit, don't you?
I dabble.
You dabble, yeah. So when did you start running?
I ran in high school. I ran and I cross-country skied in high school. I went to junior nationals for cross-country skiing. So cross-country running was kind of the warm into the cross-country ski season, which was largely my focus through high school. And then I stepped away from pretty much all athletics through college and graduate school. And I think it was my 6th year of ministry, so my professional life, where there was things going on personally and professionally, and I needed an outlet. And the easiest thing to do was just to pick up running again. And so I started running at that point. I was probably, trying to think, I was about 31 years old at that point when I picked it up, and since then never put it down pretty much.
Where were you living at that point?
By that point, we were living in the house we're in now. So we own our own home, which is here in Amherst, right around the corner from the Daven campus.
Okay, so did you start with the road or did you immediately start to the trail? Because, I mean, folks, Daven is very fast, like winning 100-milers and it's course record 100-milers across like all different kinds, like flat, technical, everything. And so that's actually how I knew you, but then listening to a lot of interviews, or knew of you, and then listening to interviews, and then also just the back and forth we've had a couple of times, like you also take marathons seriously when you run them as well. So how did it all start?
It was the road to begin with, because Buffalo is not really a trail town. If you want trails, you're going to have to drive. You're going to have to go elsewhere in order to get some elevation in trails. So the convenient thing out my door was roads. So that certainly was the initial piece for me. But that background of cross-country running and cross-country skiing always had a trail route to it. And my parents still live in Rochester, and I'm very familiar with the trail system in Rochester. And so when I could, I would often pay a visit to them and then take advantage of the trails that I knew there. And then over time began to learn of some of the trails that are a little further afield from where I am, but some of the ones that are reasonably close that I also could integrate in. But often it was maybe 2 days of trails and the rest of it was all roads. And that would have been, like 3 years into getting back into running. So it was mainly road to begin with. And I think like many people's evolution, it was one of those things of trying to get back in shape to begin with, and then seeing how fast you could get, and then seeing how far you could go. And that all was related to the road, when the marathon kind of was the pinnacle of that sense of having never done something like that, hitting that. And then from there, the question became how much further? And that's how I got into this world of ultra running. Is I finished my first marathon in pretty much about 3 hours flat. So I qualified for Boston out of the gates in that first marathon. It was a dinky little marathon in, where was it? Fayetteville, something south of Oswego. But I mean, it was like run by the YMCA. I think it had 35 people in it. And from that, I finished, and I was like, Fulton. It was the Fulton Marathon. That was it.
Did you win?
I did. I didn't know I was in first. So I crossed the line and they handed me a trophy. And I was like, I think somebody was ahead of me. But they were running a half marathon concurrently, and it was a double loop course.
Gotcha.
So I didn't realize that everybody in front of me was in the half marathon. And so when I crossed the line, I had won. And then it really became, how much faster can I do that? And how much further can I go? And I think the next thing that I did was further, and it was a 50K, and it may have been the Mendon Ponds 50K. And then 50-milers and 100Ks, and stayed around that distance for a while. And every year I've always done a marathon. It's just kind of part of what I do in a given year. So I've stuck to roads, or I have roads peppered in with the trails. It's just kind of how I balance it all out and what works leaving my door, I guess.
And in Buffalo, it's pretty icy, and in the winter, it's just up here, it's natural, you know. The roads kind of feel like a trail anyway. At least that's what I tell myself.
Definitely. And there was a year early on where I remember my wife laid down a challenge of, if you can run through a Buffalo winter, you can do anything. And so I went out every day outside and ran. And I ran through blizzard warnings and terrible conditions. And it was just one of those ultras in a different way of proving to myself that those things are not a condition that can stop you from getting out. And you know, the hardest step to take is to step out the door. And once you're out the door, you're fine.
I always, the most, sometimes the hardest one, but also the one, like the first mile is, you know, it's sometimes the hardest, but also sometimes I'm still asleep because I just like wake up and step out the door. So I'm like, well, actually I was asleep for the first mile, so then it's fine.
Yep. Yeah.
So, question though, so when it is pretty, because it gets snowy here in Ithaca too, where do you do your speed work and stuff when the roads aren't, and the track is closed and the roads aren't good? We have an indoor track here, but I don't like it because I can't breathe in there. So I'm more of a treadmill person, but what do you do?
I'm outside. If I'm running, I'm outside. I have integrated a lot more of a bike trainer into winter training when it gets really nasty. And that's just more in the last few years. I'm getting older, so a little downtime from the running has done my body well. I've had injuries in the past, so it's just trying to be mindful and give myself a little bit of an off season. But if I run outside. I've tried the treadmill, and to me, after 2 minutes, I feel like I've been on it for 2 hours. I just can't seem to wrap my head around it. So, and while there is an indoor track, I think it's a sixth of a mile, if even that. And I would just have to do endless laps, so it would feel like a hamster wheel. So I'm outside if I can be, or I use the bike trainer.
Ours is the 200 meter, and it is, oh, I cannot breathe in there. I can't do it. I always try to stay on the roads, and then well, for as long as the track is open, and then we have like a nice little path that we can use. But a lot of times it's not plowed. And then as soon as I take my first fall, I'm like, nope, I will suffer on the treadmill. Like, I do not care. And normally it's only like 1 or 2 days a week, so it's okay. Yeah.
I think it was last year. I was out on a run, and it started to rain, and that turned to sleet. Pretty soon there was black ice, and I went around a corner and just laid out flat on the road and did one of those self-assessments of, am I okay? Am I hurt? What's going on? Okay, no, I think I'm all right. But it's such a funny thing to then have to reassess your footing when everywhere that you used to be confident was where you would get traction is the last place that you get traction.
Yep, and you're running on the snow instead of on the sidewalk. Yeah.
Yep.
Had a bunch of those. So when you started ultras, did you have immediate success? I know your first one was in 2010, so you've been doing this for 10 years, so you're very experienced.
Yeah.
Did you have a lot of success when you first started?
I think, I'm trying to recall, my first Can Lake 50, I think I got 4th. So I guess I would call that reasonable success for not knowing at all what I was doing. And what followed then after that was a very quick acclimation into how to take apart an ultra and get even more successful. So my times dropped quick. I learned much better techniques for hydration and nutrition and what works for me. So yeah, I would say that there was success pretty early on. I'd say it probably took about a year for me to really lock into something. And I'm still, anybody that's run ultras, even as many as I have or anybody else, says that this is not something that you suddenly have mastery of because everyone is unique. It's still a learning process, but there's a lot now that is just part of my toolkit in how I approach these.
Mm-hmm. There's so many variables in ultras that there's so much that can go wrong, but there's also a lot of things that can go right. And like, if you can find, like, say, I remember listening to you say, now you wear higher socks because one time your socks fell down your shoe. And so there's one thing like that. Like, that's just like an annoyance that could turn into a blister, which could turn into something that takes you out. Like, or how you and your dad have your nutrition pretty dialed. Like, this is what he needs. This is this, this is this. And that's pretty cool. I mean, like, I guess it makes it a little bit, it must be a little bit more like, comforting and just reassuring that you have certain things nailed down that you know always work.
Yes, yeah, and there definitely is some of those which are always part of the plan, and then those which are unique for a given setting. So a hot race is going to ask for different things versus a late fall ultra marathon, or a really technical trail is going to be different than a fast road or an easier trail.
So how are you with the transition from running to hiking? I find that I struggle with that, and that's why I don't really choose technical ultras, and I just like running. And so to me, hiking during a race, I don't feel like I'm racing anymore, and then I sort of lose like that, oh, this is a race, that fire, you know? Whereas the races that I've done the past 2 years, and even the ultras that I've chosen, they're runnable, so I run the whole thing. How do you balance, like, because you were speedy, you do marathons, like you still know how to run a whole race. How have you taught your mind to stay engaged in the race even when you're walking?
It's a really good question, and I've come to a place where the way that I approach a race is, I think, similar to you. I look for races that are what I would call runnable. So I certainly have people that I admire and are within my running circle that look for the most technical, craziest course they can find. You know, it's something that's using the Devil's Path and Catskills or something like that. But that's not runnable. It's a hike run. There are pieces they're going to run, but there's a lot that's hiking. And that doesn't play to what I think are my best assets as a runner and where I get the most enjoyment. So I try to look for that balance. That being said, late in a 100-miler, even a mild hill becomes far more significant. And I think it's just trying to remember to walk with purpose and only walk where it's absolutely necessary. So a lot of times I'll use an aid station just as that intermediary place to walk. I'm going to walk through the aid station, then I'll run out the other side. Or specific hills, if it's a looped course, after I've got the course down in my head, as I get into the later loops, I'll say in my head, I'm going to walk, you know, this hill, and this hill, and that's it. I'm going to run the rest. So I really just try to make sure that I'm walking with purpose, that not walking in defeat. And I think that's what I see a lot of times, is that when people start walking, you see their arms drop, you see them slow down, you see their posture really get sloppy. And when you hike or walk with purpose, your pace really kind of stays the same in some ways. You're evening that pace off without burning matches going up the hills, you know, and torturing your heart through those.
Yeah, now that makes a lot more sense. I'll have to remember that if I ever do another race where I have to walk. Could happen in a marathon, you never know. I mean, walk with purpose. So when you were, a couple of the interviews that I listened to, you basically do 200 milers a year, and those are your focus. And then the other races are they're training races, but I like what you said, how even if they are training races, you're still running hard. It's still a big effort. It's not like, well, this is a training race, you know, my 50K to my 100K. And I think that's really important. And so talk about that. Like, how do you, like, running a marathon really hard takes me out for like a month. So yeah. How are you able to, one, like, still run these races very fast and then recover enough to get so that it was a training stimulus for your next effort?
I think that part of it is, over time, your body really does adapt to the stress. And so the more that you do this, the faster the recovery between the efforts, no matter what the effort is, give it a hard road marathon or a 100-miler. And so as I got deeper into this, I would find that, you know, while in the early times, it would take 2 weeks before I would be sore anymore and feel like, well, maybe I can go out and attempt to run. Now it's more like 2 days if I'm not even doing a light jog the next day, just to get some of the waste out of my legs. And I think a lot of that is just physical adaptation. Is my body's just gotten used to the stress that I throw at it. And I guess in that way, it's become more normal. That being said, per the interview that you listened to, I've never figured out how to put my toe on a start line and not try to put everything I have into whatever that day is.
Same.
So, you know, there are people out there that are like, oh yeah, no, I can dial it back to 80% or use this as a training run. I don't know how to do that. If I'm in a race, I'm going to try my best within that race as best I can. I think the only times where it's easier to back off is if you're leading well. It may be a little easy to just kind of ease off the gas a little bit. But I've always sort of gone into every race with the best of intentions of putting forth everything I've got into it. The 100-milers certainly are more of a focus in the sense of the intensity of the training that it takes to get there, at least the way that I approach them. So even if I'm using those races as a lead into the 100-milers, in some ways it's to tax the body in a way that only races can replicate. As good as I am with speed work and tempo and intervals, there's nothing like a race to really put you in that position and to tax you and get you to that place that you're going to get to no matter what distance you're accomplishing.
Yeah, I want you to say more about that. And then I also want to talk about how you train for a 100-miler, like what your week would look like. But first, I completely agree. Like there's nothing like a race, and it's very interesting. I'm someone that, at least right now, it might change. I generally run workouts slower than my racing times indicate. So, I mean, it happened at the Olympic trials. My training indicated that I could probably run a 250, and I ended up running a 244. So, I don't know, in races, I just care more. I know that this pain is there. I like it. And so definitely, especially in the time now, there are no races, and I'm just not jazzed for virtual races. So I'm just, training and putting money in the bank, and I will wait for the races to resume. I'm not into the virtual thing. And so, yeah, I really agreed with when you said that, there's nothing like a race, and also racing teaches you how to race. So people that have race anxiety, if you do it more often, it's not that bad. And then also you don't put as much stock in one race, because then you could be, well, you do, but then also it's well, now I know for the next one, which is, hopefully won't be in a year, So yeah, I completely subscribe to what you're talking about there. It makes tons of sense.
Yeah, and I used to race a lot more than I do now. I've sort of backed off. Some of that is just based on trying to be responsible with my home life and work life, as well as, the pleasure that I get out of running, and to put all of those things in balance. But there was a while where every year I was at least trying to do a marathon, a 50K, a 50-miler, a 100K, and a 100-miler. At least those 5. And oftentimes I would do another marathon or a second 100-miler or something. Well, that's a lot of racing in a given year when you space that out. Even if it's over 5 months, that's a lot of racing in 5 months. And so I've changed some since then in how much I do. But as you said, it taught me how to race. When you race that much, you do kind of just learn how to race. And I think those of us that ran cross country in high school or college or otherwise, you raced frequently through those time periods, and it does just kind of teach you how to peak in some ways, but also how racing encourages a gear that you just can't get in any other format, I don't think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when you were training for 100-milers, it still are when you are training, I don't know if you are right now, but how would you structure your week?
My week, I do a 6-day running week and do 2 bouts of speed work. So usually I do a speed work on Monday and a speed work on Wednesday. One of them will be a tempo speed work, integrated into a, 14 or 16 mile run. And the other one will be intervals. And most likely the intervals will either be hill repeats or mile intervals. The day between will still be a pretty decent run, 12 to 14 miles. So 16 miles, 12 to 14, another 16 on Wednesday. Then I do a simple 6 miler on Thursday as my low day. So a very short day, but I cross train on that day doing a lot of just body weight exercises. So a lot of toe lifts on stairs and things like that. Then I'll do back-to-back long runs Friday, Saturday. Usually I'll do my longer one on Friday and a slightly shorter one on Saturday. And those will grow in length through the training period. So I might start off with doing 2 or 2.5 hours Friday, 2 to 2.5 hours on Saturday. By the end of the training, I'll be doing 4 hours on Friday and 4 hours on Saturday. So I think the mileage ends up kind of peaking out somewhere around 120 to 130 miles at peak. And I found that it's a formula that works. It's just at that edge of what is reasonable. I think just at the edge of where I might get injured, which I think any of us that have tried to be competitive, we're always running right on that edge, very, very close to injury, but trying not to tip over into injury. And for me, I've just found that the rubric of at least making sure that you have a cumulative distance in a week that is more than 10% greater than the length that you're racing will get you to the finish line, at least as a primary goal. So for me, I've always tried to make sure that I've got a 110-mile week to be able to run a 100-miler, for example. But I'm usually beyond that. But that for me is sort of my benchmark.
Okay. Have you had any overuse injuries?
I'm trying to remember how many stress fractures I've had now. So yes, yep, I've had tibial stress fractures. I had one way back in high school. And then I think I've had 3 since. It's been a few years now. My stress fractures are always in the spring, in the early spring. So we're sort of nailing down that it's likely due to vitamin D deficiency, that I'm not metabolizing calcium. So my bones are weak, and then I start training more. And, you sort of get that effect. So I've started to be very careful about my mileage in the spring now, and a little more mindful of cross training. And I really don't up my mileage until I get into the month of, till I get past, March. So in April, May is where I start to tick up the mileage, and it seems to be working well for me now. Unfortunately, that repeated history is a strong educator.
Yeah, it does seem like a lot of mileage, but you've had success. So you normally do, Mohican and Oil Creek every year? Is this true?
I've done Oil Creek 4 times, 3 or 4. I did Mohican 2 years ago. I've done Burning River. I did the Indiana 100. I've gotten to a place also where now I'm just kind of like doing a one and done scenario. There's just so much out there to see that unless I'm really tied to a race, I really am looking at an opportunity to go somewhere new, see something different, race it, and then pursue something else. And that may have to do with a little reflection on my age and how many miles are on my odometer and how much racing I have ahead of me. So I have done Oil Creek more than anything else. I don't think I've repeated a 100-miler anywhere else but Oil Creek. And that's just sort of the one that's closest to my backyard. So in 2 hours, I can be there and I can train on the course, which is a reasonable drive distance to do it on a given day, and run a full loop there and then drive home and be home. So yeah, I think I'm up to 7 or 8 100-milers I've done.
That's pretty convenient. Also, it must, like, repeating that race, it's easier to, like, dial down exactly what you want to do per loop. So what do you do on each loop? Like, what is Daven's scientific formula for Oil Creek?
So Oil Creek has water-only self-serve aid stations about every 3 miles, and they have full aid stations about every 7 or so. So you have an aid station at 7, one at 13, one at 16, 17, one back at the start finish. So every loop is about 50K or so. And the way, trying to remember this all in my head. The way that I break it down is I see my crew at the midpoint, so at mile 13. It's a little more than that, but about mile 13, let's call it, or mile 15, and then back at the start finish. So those are my main aid places. So that is where I'm getting nutrition and different kind of hydration. Between that, I only do water and usually a gel. So essentially every 15 miles, so call it every 7, I'm water and gel, and every 15 I'm having some more substance. So I'll do coconut water, potatoes and salt, watermelon. There's a whole sort of pantry of things that we use depending on where we are in the race. I've used hard-boiled eggs for protein, just to put an anchor in the stomach to provide a little sense of being full, because you can get to a point where you're just hungry. But that's kind of how I break it apart. I know the course really well, so I know where to push, where it's really, really runnable, and the other places where it's better just to kind of like pull back and go a little easier on it. It's a very treat course, so even if it's hot, you've got a lot of sun protection, so there isn't a lot of sun exposure. But I've reached a place even with that race where of the 100-miler has 3 full loops plus a unique going home loop. So in doing it 4 times, if you take how many times I've run that loop, I've seen that course so much that I really don't want to see it again. And I love the race director and I love the course, but that's a lot of loops in one place. And so I do know it well. So it's almost become a bad thing in the sense of I know it so well that I know where I am in the loop and what's coming up and what's left ahead. But for me, the way I've kind of ended up breaking it down is by loops. So I don't count miles, I count loops. Okay, that's 1 loop down. I got 2 more full loops. Okay, there's 2 loops down. If I get in the 3rd loop, I know I'm going to finish. Okay, through the 3rd loop, all I got is the going home loop. That's short. I got this in the bag. So it's how also I mentally have figured out how to break down the race. So I'm not looking at the total accumulated mileage, but rather looking at it in a smaller segment. So in this case, just loops.
I prefer looped courses, actually, because then at least, like, I mean, I don't know if I would like to do them as many times as you have, but like, I like it because then I know where I can push and where I can, get food or wherever on the next loop. I prefer that. Some people think that's really boring, but for me, it works in my brain.
Yeah, I've done both. Burning River was a point-to-point course. And there have been others that I've done that have been point-to-point. I'm trying to think. That's the one that comes to mind, at least the 100-miler that comes to mind. But as you said, when they give you the mileage till the next aid station, it isn't always exactly accurate. And so in a looped course, you know exactly where it's coming after you've run that 1 loop. You know where those aid stations are. You know, like you said, where to push. You know where they've got porta-johns if that's what your need is. So it is a little different. And can kind of at least take your mind off of those aspects and just trying to figure out where is the next aid station, when is it going to come, what are they going to have, all of those kind of factors.
So the last time that I talked to you before asking you to come on was before Philly. How did that go?
Philly was fun. It was a fun marathon. I liked it a lot, and most of the people who were there running it, it seemed like they felt the same. I wasn't in sort of great marathon shape. I still went sub 3 hours. I forget what I did there, 2:55 or 2:53, which is far off my PR, but I was happy with the day.
It was a really crappy day.
It was, yeah, the weather was not pleasant. But I was happy with where I was at. I was coming off of the Indiana 100 3 weeks earlier, I think, and hadn't put in a lot of training since then. So, it was fun to be there with friends. If I was approaching it seriously, I would have approached it a little differently as far as my prep beforehand and sleeping arrangements and things like that. But it worked out for what it was, and I was pretty happy with it.
Yeah, you guys had a whole Rochester contingent go down.
Yes, yeah, and I think there's only one other time that I've been in a scenario where there's been sort of house that's been arranged, and it's just full of runners spending the weekend together. And it's kind of a fun thing to nerd out over running for a whole weekend with people.
Yeah. You saying that reminds me, I think the first time I actually met you was in the 2016 Cayuga Trails. I had run the Buffalo Marathon, my first marathon ever, like the week before. Ian asked me to like come and help like put these markers on the course that were like, you win a pie or like whatever. And I think you had just run a race too. And so Ian was like, just go the opposite way Daven goes. And I'm like, I don't know who Daven is and whatever. And I remember like, I think like just being like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm really slow. I just ran a marathon like only a week ago. And and you're like, I ran 100 miles last week. And I was just like, oh, okay.
I do remember that, because I remember you saying, I so admire the people running these trails. Maybe someday I'll get into trails as well. But yeah, I rode in your car as we put those markers around.
Yeah. And then I had trail. So yeah, it was great. Yeah. But Ian definitely is good at putting us all to work. So it was great. And then I did run it a couple years later. Who knew? So with that, all the races being canceled, you and I have had to face we just don't get the most out of ourselves if it's not a race pretty like now until everything stops. So what were your plans after? So you won the Mendon like fat ass last runner standing thing on March 7th. But what were your spring plans?
So I had planned to do the Rock and Roll DC Marathon in March. It was at the end of March. Both my brothers live in DC, and I've done that marathon pretty much every year. And that's sort of my lead into the season. So that's when I'm starting to tick up in mileage, but a marathon keeps me low enough in my mileage that I can kind of approach that well. So that was first on my calendar. And so that was the first thing canceled. Following that, I was going to do the Buffalo Distant Classic 6-hour race, which I've run before, and I think I'm still the record holder on that one. And that's just close to my house, and I just thought, okay, that's going to take the marathon and sort of expand it by double or more in the sense of time on my feet, and again, in a race situation. And a lot of this was trying to structure a spring for when I finally get into Western states, to try to follow the same program in the spring I get into Western states, if it worked out for me. After that one, I had something I was going to do in May. Now I'm trying to remember what. But the big one was Kettle Moraine. So Kettle Moraine was my 100-miler. It was in June. It would have been a week or 2 weeks before Western states. I didn't get in Western states this year. It was my 6th lottery entry. So next time I enter, it will be my 7th time. But time-wise, it put it kind of on the same timeline as when Western States was going to be. And so that was my plan really for the year. And then I was going to shift over into cycling. I built out a gravel bicycle over the winter. And so I was going to kind of dabble my toes in those waters of gravel races and gravel cycling, see what it was all about before doing some runs in the fall. But it's all gone by the wayside now.
Yeah, I know a lot of us are like, we really want you to get into Western states. It's like when Jason got in, that was good. But like, that was like, okay, cool. But we're like, we really want Daven to get into Western states because you could do some damage. And it'd be really awesome to just watch the whole thing go down. So we're pinning for you here in Ithaca too.
Yeah, it's now just become one of those things. There's so many years of entry that it's its own animal, in the sense of I have to run a race, I have to get into this, I have to have this as part of my palmarès. So
yeah, one day it'll happen, Daven.
It'll happen.
So have you been gravel biking or have you been running? What are you doing?
I'm doing a little bit of everything. So I tried, after everything got canceled in the spring, I signed up for the Arkansas Traveler 100, which was supposed to be in October. That's already been canceled. And I'm on the wait list for Hennepin 100. My guess is it's going to be canceled too. At this point, I'm just planning on the fact that it's going to be canceled. And my dad, who crews me, he's a medical doctor, and he's very nervous about all this stuff right now. So I'm not sure that he's really keen on anything that would require out-of-state travel and staying in hotel and, visiting bathrooms between home and that place or at races. So I'm trying to be mindful of those things. So when everything kind of locked down and all the races evaporated, I got lazy real quick. And I think it was easy for many of us to do that because the things that were our driving ambitions were no longer there. And after 2 weeks of being lazy, I put myself on a rigid training schedule. Why, I don't know. But essentially, I in that schedule, had myself prepping to run a 100-miler this week. Not with any ambition to actually go out and run 100-milers, but just in the structure of the plan, this would have been the week to do it. So I did that, and I've now just kind of cycled myself back into the start of that program again. On my low mileage day, I've been doing some gravel cycling or paddle boarding or, whatever, just getting out in other ways. So I have dabbled some. It's been nice to get out there on the bike just as a change of scenery, and gravel biking, I can see it's parallel to ultra running because it's off the beaten path a little bit, but it's still sort of that slow burn of endurance that works with me well versus road cycling, which just seems to be like hammering until, like fast marathoning in some ways, which I enjoy, but is a little different than being out in the trees and off the beaten path a little bit. So yeah, I'm getting some of it in, not as much as I was planning on. I've been running more just out of convenience, I think.
Yeah, apparently Cayuga is still happening next weekend, and
I've seen that. Yeah.
I don't. So my training, I thought I was going to be doing ultras this spring. I'm actually doing more 5 and 10K training on the roads, which I really love, actually. And so I just haven't really, I've been paying attention to trail and ultra running just because I like it. I'm a nerd, but I haven't really been doing it. And when I realized, yesterday or the day before that Cuba Trails was still happening, I was like, wait, what? We're still in a pandemic. So I haven't talked to Ian about that. But apparently it's still going on. I will most likely have to work, so I'm not going to go out there. And I also just don't know if I feel comfortable doing it right now. I mean, I work I'm an essential worker, so I expose myself a lot anyway. So yeah, I don't know if I'm going to race again in 2020, and I've come to peace with that. And
yeah.
Also, yeah, I agree with you. The month of March was like my mopey bag of pudding month. I just didn't have any direction. I felt like crap. I didn't really know what I was doing. And then I started to come back into it, but I really just had to have that, feel all the feelings, that mopey, just oh God, what's going on here? And then just release myself from anything that I thought I was going to do. And now running is super fun, and I've never done anything like this before because I didn't run before, so it's really fun. So yeah, it came back.
I think that's, I suppose, my take from this experience is we've all had to sort of make a decision about how much we just really enjoy doing it when there isn't a clear objective. And it allows a rediscovery of just the simple pleasure of running. No longer is it about clicking off a specific time or working towards a specific race. It's running for the sake of running. And that's been liberating in a different way and exposing sort of a side of it that I had forgotten for quite some time. The races will be there when we get back to them, and that'll, I think, be a joy when we can return to those things. I've tried some of the virtual stuff. I'm still connected into two, but logging all the mileage is just starting to get to be a grind that I don't care for anymore. But there's a race director here, one of the race directors of the Buffalo Marathon. He set up the virtual New York 434. So that is something which is the distance between Niagara Square in downtown Buffalo and Times Square in New York City. And I signed up for that. I'm past Syracuse. I think at this point I might be past Rochester, on my way back to Buffalo. So that would be twice the distance.
That's cool.
But it's, they're not real in the same sense that a race, when you're there with other people and you're towing a line and there's a clock ticking, it's just more almost like a group run where everybody is, it's a certificate of achievement. You did it too. Good job.
I do really like, I don't know if you've seen what like the Bowerman Track Club is doing and like some of like the Hoka NAZ Elite, like I don't mind. I kind of like the inter squad racing and stuff like that. I've thought about that. I've just been really busy with my job and other things, but like maybe because two of my training partners, I mean, we all qualified for the trials. We got some other people that are pretty fast. I bet we could get something going, but I haven't had the bandwidth to, and I don't have I'm not paid to run and do these kind of things. So I don't really have anyone helping me organize anything. So but I'm into that kind of thing. If it's like racing, with like 2 or 3 other people and we're like doing it distantly and stuff like that, I could see getting into that, but because that actually feels like a race. But no, when it's just a virtual thing, it's not the same.
As you said, I'm hard pressed to find the same gear that I would find when I race. So Trails Rock, they did a COVID-19 and you could choose 1.9K or there's 3 different distances, 19K or 19 miles. And I did the 19 miles, and then another runner kind of threw down and he ran it a few seconds faster. So I went out a day later and I clipped him by 2 seconds actually. So, but it was without anybody around. And I just thought, if we were actually racing head to head against each other, this would have been a much different scenario for both of us. It would have brought out a whole nother gear for both of us, and we would have achieved, I think, even better times.
Yeah, it's just the time we're in. We're all learning to be patient and wait.
Yep.
All right. Well, Daven, this has been a wonderful conversation. Your knowledge and your experience is huge and vast, and I think everybody will really enjoy this conversation. Where can people, if they can, find you online, or should I just direct them to your ultra sign up, or I don't know if you're an Instagram or a Facebook guy?
I am on Facebook and Instagram. Instagram is @RunDaddyRun. So that's my email as well, is rundaddyrun@me.com. It's something my daughter said when I was really young, which is DADDE. So Daddy. And Facebook, it's my name, Daven Oskvig. So if you look that up, you can find me on Facebook. And my Facebook page is really, I only use it for running. I don't use it for professional stuff. I don't post a lot, but I am on Instagram and Twitter as well if people want to find me. Although I'm pretty quiet on most things, just to forewarn folks.
A lot of us could deal with being a little bit more quiet on social media. We could all do that.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate your invitation to be a part of this.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Daven, and have a wonderful evening. And I'll let you know when the show comes out.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Ellie.
Bye.
Hi, Trail Collective. I was asked to give a rundown of a recent FKT that I attempted and accomplished. And so I wanted to give you a little breakdown of that trail and what I did and what led up to it. And yeah, so I recently ran end-to-end the Northville Placid Trail, which runs essentially through the heart of the Adirondack Park in upstate New York. As the name implies, it begins and ends in the villages of Northville on the southern end and Lake Placid on the northern end. It was originally laid out in 1922, so it has origins that go way back into some of the beginnings, you might say, of the Adirondack Park, with the largest additions or reroutes to the trail occurring just recently, 2013, 2015. That was all on the southern end, so near the Northville end of the trail, to try to eliminate a lot of road running that had been prior to get into the village of Northville. So it was a reroute to take away some of those road miles. The original FKTs that were set were prior to the reroutes of 2013 and 2015 and comprised only the trail section, so did not include the larger road section that ran into Northville or the little bit of road section on the other end at Lake Placid. There's variations in what marks the beginning of the trail. Some say it's the corner of Ayersville and Old Military and Lake Placid. Some say it's the trailhead right on Ayersville Road. And the oldest versions have the old depot in Lake Placid, the village of Lake Placid, as the original terminus. So I ran from the old depot because I was going with those oldest sources, which suggested that as the original terminus. The prior record that was set was in 2011. That was Cheryl Wheeler. She did the 122-mile trail route in 1 day, 11 hours, and 13 minutes. I covered the same distance in 1 day, 8 hours, and 17 minutes. And the expanded trail, which is 142 miles, so 20 miles further than the old trail, I managed in 1 day, 14 hours, and 44 minutes. It was a trail that I had been aware of and kind of explored prior, not in any formative way. I'd never been out to the trail, but I knew of it. And I was recording a podcast, the Running Inside Out podcast, and the moderator, as we discussed, like all of the races being canceled and things of that nature, had suggested, well, what about the Northville Placid Trail? So I blame him for planting the seed, Chris O'Brien for planting the seed in my head, and within a couple of weeks, I think I made my first trek out to the Northville Placid Trail and my first sort of subtle attempt. So I made two attempts prior to this one in this same year. I went into them thinking that if I felt good, I would cover the whole distance. And if I didn't feel that it was possible, then I would cut them short. And in both cases prior, I cut them short. So the first one I ran in late July, out of Lake Placid, heading south to Northville, and I cut it short at Wakely Dam, so about 65 miles or so of running. I decided I had had enough that day. I returned 2 weeks later and started at the southern terminus in Northville, running north, and again decided I had enough at Wakely Dam, and I covered 74 miles at that point on that day. Following that day, my legs felt great. I didn't feel like it had any lingering soreness or anything that really would have suggested that I had really torn stuff up. But I had done the trail then completely with both the halves, and so wasn't necessarily thinking of returning as I had seen the whole trail. That was enough for me. I covered it. Yay, wasn't that great. In a week later, I went out having the trail really in my legs and did two trails closer to where I live for the FKTs, managed to set FKTs in both of them. So first I did the Letchworth branch of the Finger Lakes Trail, which is just a little over a marathon in length, and managed to set the fastest known time on that. And then with just a day between, I went to the Girard Hiking Trail in Oil Creek State Park in Pennsylvania, and managed to set fastest known time on the full Girard, which much of the Girard is used for the Oil Creek 100 race, but this one also includes a southern portion of that is not used in the race. And that one's about 33 1/3 mile or so, so a little over 50K in length, and set the fastest known time on that. So I was running well, and I felt like, well, what else should I do, when a running friend suggested that I had done these two halves, and I really had only one option before me, and that was to marry the two halves together. So I established a weekend that I was going to make that final attempt on. I assembled a crew, so more of a full complement of people, which I had not done in the previous two attempts, to be with me, to pace me, to support me in whatever way I could, and continued my training to lead up to that as it hadn't been, and then went for it. So the weekend was September 19th and 20th. The temperatures on that weekend were the first ones to really be below freezing in the area, and so the low temperature as I started on the morning of September 19th, which was a Saturday, was 28 degrees. So I started out of Lake Placid heading south at 28 degrees and about 3 a.m., a little before 3 a.m. And I covered that first 100 miles in about 21, 22 hours or so less than 24 hours. The day warmed up nicely into around 50 or a little less than 50. I ran really well through sections that followed the big long section. It's a 38-mile section from Lake Placid to Long Lake. And then that's followed by two sort of half marathon length sections of trail. Both of those flowed really well. I ran into Wakely really well in the light still. So there's a beaver flooded area. I knew I was going to get across that in the light and into the next 50K section well in the light. So I was really feeling good through that first 100 and going into the first full night. Temperature dropped and dropped fast back into the upper 20s. And when I came off that section, which would have been about the first 100 miles, I got into a car and was very, very cold and slept for about an hour and managed to get my core temperature back up. And after that, basically had said, I'm going to attempt this next road section. So there was 3.5 miles of road to move from that section of trail to the next 50K of trail through the village of Passeco, basically. And had concluded that if I couldn't keep my body temperature up, I couldn't go back into the woods and the trail for 50K. But ran through that section and warmed up quite well. And so went into the next section, and I knew that going into that section, I would finish the trail in the fullest. That if I went into that section, I would come out of that section, and coming out of that section with only about 13 miles left, I was going to finish the whole trail. So I largely, almost entirely walked that next 50K section. So grabbed trekking poles and walked through as we walked through the night into the next morning and midday. And it would only be in the final 5 miles of the attempt that I managed to run again. So I ran basically through the first 100 and then walked for the next 30-ish, 30-ish plus, running the last 5. And I guess for me, the motivation why I attempted it was, number one, I love the Adirondack Park, and here's one that basically comprised some sense of going through the entire park in a single trail or single attempt. Secondly, I've run a number of 100-milers, and I guess I was curious to know where my limit was in the sense of both miles and time. And my sense is, having completed it, I've just about found that edge for myself. But I was surprised to find for myself that in those final miles, I could run again. Just a few days after finishing the trail, with my legs in good shape, I started to run miles again, and I'm running pretty decently right now. I don't know that I have any ambitions for anything, but yeah, so that's a little bit. There is a video, maybe they'll link it on here, of some of the pictures that were taken during that attempt. You can see sort of my change in clothes that mark the temperature changes and some of the beauty of the trail, but it's an amazing trail, and more should get out there and do it. I know many people do it as a multi-day thing, and I certainly now am reflecting on it, thinking about doing it as a fast pack to enjoy some more of the scenery that is there along the NPT, the Northville Placid Trail, maybe doing it in like 4 days or 3 days, maybe even 5, as opposed to just the day plus that I spent doing it. So there's a little bit about my FKT.